agreed to, and I call the member for Bega.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Today I rise to speak on the Treasury Law Amendments, Tax Incentive and Integrity Bill 2024. For many, this is essentially a little bit of an omnibus bill that brings together a number of schedules with very different areas that it touches on. The Omnibus Bill tries to close loopholes and encourage transition to electric vehicles in one of its schedule. So it has three key parts. First, it's tightening up the luxury car tax rules, but really does not go far enough. It introduces that only electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles qualify for tax breaks, but I will say more on that in a minute because there is an issue around this remaining area around plug-in hybrids. The second part of the bill removes the ability to deduct interest charges on tax liability, and third schedule extends the ATO's notification period for retaining BAS funds from 14 to 30 days. Some of these changes are necessary and overdue. However, there are concerns regarding unintended impacts, in particular in relation to the second schedule, the impacts on small business. So first of all, on the luxury car tax changes. Now, we know from a decarbonisation point of view, transport is an area, it is a low-hanging fruit where we can and must accelerate our decarbonisation. The world is transitioning. We do not have a local car manufacturing, and so we have to, as a matter of urgency, move towards electric vehicles. There is a lot of misinformation as to the safety of electric vehicles and the range of electric vehicles. Much of that comes from those trying to hold on to fossil fuels and old combustion engines. The reality is a number of players in the field are improving the issue when it comes to access to charging facilities in regional as well as our urban areas. I know NRMA and others are installing a lot of fast charging. The reality is most average users don't do a huge number of kilometres, and the range of electric cars is absolutely sufficient. I have, for example, travelled by electric car from my electorate down to Canberra. I've gone to Jindabyne, to the Snowy Mountains. I've done a number of long journeys, and there is a really good network out there. And so this constant misinformation seeds to drive doubt around range and encourages people to think that there has to be this holding on to the past when it comes to combustion vehicles and relying on ongoing fossil fuels. So we know the sector pathways and the Climate Change Authority put out sectoral pathway recommendations, but they're really not sufficient. They're not driving enough ambition yet. We know when it comes to our transport sector, we need to get to net zero, and we have the ability to do that. The first and easiest is around passenger vehicles, and that fleet needs to get to net zero. And I've been on a number of inquiries, and the amount of misinformation is quite staggering, really, that still gets peddled out there. But the reality is the faster we transition to fully electric vehicles, the sooner we cut emissions and we reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. And we really cannot afford to delay. And there is a silver lining to this as well, which is the noise pollution. For anyone who has travelled in electric vehicles, they know, it's from a respiratory illnesses, from a noise, all of those aspects are improved so significantly. And we have developing more and more solutions when it comes to heavy transport as well and that electrification. But this legislation, whilst it is closing a little bit of the loophole around the tax incentives and definitions around electric and plug-in hybrids. As I said, it's keeping this loophole for plug-in hybrids. Now, I know there are regional members of government that have been lobbying for keeping in plug-in hybrids into this legislation. And to me, it is stemmed from that misunderstanding and actually the lack of experience of actually driving in electric vehicles to understand that they actually deliver. For example, when it comes to the utes, I met with an Australian company up in ironically, the electorate of the opposition leader in Dixon, a company, Oz EV, who are transitioning and making sure that we have fully electric heavy-duty utes that can work on mines and other sites. This is an incredibly, positive move, but of course they don't receive the support, I don't believe, from their local member. The reality is we have too many loopholes still too many people using passenger vehicles and utes that aren't, not always for a commercial or a trade use. And these are heavy, dangerous vehicles on our roads and high-emitting vehicles. And so this loophole for utes that remains in this legislation is bad and needs to be addressed, and I urge the government to address this. Stand up, put forward some serious plans to enable that transition to happen and close that loophole when it comes to that. The next schedule addresses the extension for the ATO's notification period for retaining refunds relating to the BAS statements in an important measure to combat fraud. With scams becoming more sophisticated, especially through social media, it's even more critical. As I understand it from the Minister, the measure will provide the Australian Tax Office with the breathing room they need to investigate and crack down on fraudulent statements. I support this, and so this measure appears to be fairly well-founded, especially if it supports efforts to uphold tax integrity. I am concerned, though, around protecting small business. So many in this place talk a big game in terms of small business, but the reality is, both from the major parties, opposition or in government, big business has their ear, and all too often small business is mentioned. There's a lot of talk, but very little action when it actually comes to in fact standing up or putting proposals, detailed proposals that will actually help small business. So the question around this removal of interest deductibility on tax liabilities, look, I support improvements to tax integrity, but we must ensure when we're closing loopholes, we're not in fact making it even harder for small businesses to survive. So there is a risk of disproportionately through this change impacting small businesses who are already struggling with cash flow. And while under this proposal the ATO will retain flexibility to remit in cases of financial hardships, it requires discretion from the ATO. And the feedback I get from small businesses in Warringah is they are not seeing any discretion or flexibility from the ATO. In fact, they are seeing a crackdown that makes it incredibly hard for them to remain operating. So to ensure that we do actually have sensible things that help small business, we need to make sure I have amendments to suggest to this legislation to actually improve it. The government circulated an amendment to extend the instant asset write-off until 30 June 2025. Now, we've been having a debate about this instant asset write-off for some 2 years now, and it's really unacceptable that the delay has meant small businesses can't rely on it. They have no certainty and they cannot make investment decisions for their business knowing that this is going to be available to it, because it simply hasn't been. It's on the table, it gets announced, but then the legislation to give it effect isn't there. So a small business struggling with their cash flow cannot legitimately commit to an investment or spending on the assumption that they may be able to write off that asset, but then not be able to because the government and the opposition have not come together to pass the legislation necessary. So it's really important that businesses get that certainty. This is a measure that's been announced for a number of years now, and I've been trying to amend it for a number of years to give businesses more certainty, not last-minute slapdash amendments, especially now when we're looking at it last sitting weeks before an election possibly. So I support that we are the government again introducing it, but I think we need to think about the quantum. Now, 20,000 does not really support small businesses in terms of investing into their new machinery or businesses, things that will actually make a difference. They, in fact, need that asset write-off threshold, and that's why I move an amendment to. I will be moving an amendment in consideration in detail to increase that from 20,000 to 50,000. That is what they're asking for. They're saying meaningfully for investment into infrastructure or plants or areas, anything that will genuinely assist with the efficiencies of their businesses, that is where the threshold needs to be. It also needs to be made permanent. They need certainty. Small businesses are the backbone of our economy. In Warringah alone, we have over 8,000 small businesses and 12,000 sole traders. They're driving innovation, creating jobs, they're strengthening our local economy. Just last week, I met with a group of small businesses and the Chambers of Commerce, and they are quite desperate. I can't convey that to the government clearly enough. They spoke of the impact these issues and other changes are having on their operations. They're feeling the increasing amount of regulation coming through, that the government is making it impossible to run a small business. They don't feel like they are cared for by the major parties or by the government at the moment. There is no assistance provided to help them wrestle with increasing pressures from an unstable economy. Now, their issues range from their operations, the costs of compliance, the IR changes, the amount of changes in the last few years have made it impossible for them to keep up. And the compliance, of course, the ATO being tough. Also, the staffing shortage and the changes that have happened around immigration and visas, for example, have also made it harder for them to be able to sponsor visas. The cost of sponsoring staff to come and fill vacancies to be able to operate is huge. And these are all areas that chip away at the viability of small businesses. And the numbers don't lie. Just last year, in the last financial year, ASIC reported that small business in construction, retail, hospitality made up the majority of insolvencies. There have been many discussions, as I said, about in this place about small business, but we need to actually get on to action. Productivity Commission, in their Advancing Prosperity report, increasingly from business groups as well, have argued that greater productivity measures are needed to help our economy and get small to medium-sized businesses moving. So that can be paired with deregulation measures that favour small businesses, such as meaningful taxation reform and simplification on compliance reporting. Small businesses have also continued to advocate for an increase to the limit of the instant asset write-off. The Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry said that a 20,000 threshold does not provide the necessary economic stimulus needed for small business. The National Electrical and Communications Association argued that the cost of essential technical equipment far exceeds this limit and an increase to the threshold of 50,000 is necessary. So whilst 20,000 may enable a small business to purchase small, short-lived assets such as computers for an office, fridge, kitchen, those kind of items, it's not sufficient for meaningful investment into equipment, plant and machinery, which will provide substantial productivity benefits. Ultimately, we have growing economic uncertainty and we need to get rid of that risk element by making sure there is certainty, and that is why making the instant asset write-off permanent is essential, so we don't get into political argy-bargy that means it's on again, off again. We know that is so damaging. Whilst I support overall this legislation, I will be moving amendments to support small businesses in consideration in detail, and I urge the government close the loopholes on the luxury car tax and get on with incentivising clean net zero transport, and don't keep the room in for dirty fossil combustion engines that do nothing to decarbonise Australia.